Welcome to DCF Investigations. Imagine, if you will, the quintessential image of the American dream in the early 1960s. It is a time of manicured lawns, white picket fences, and a pervasive sense of post-war optimism. The terrifying shadow of the Cold War looms in the distance. But in the affluent suburbs of Lincoln, Massachusetts, life feels insulated, safe, and predictable. It is a world where neighbors know each other's names, where doors are often left unlocked, and where the most pressing concern of the day might be a PTA meeting or a dinner party menu. But on an overcast Tuesday in October of 1961, that illusion of safety was shattered in a way that haunts the town, and indeed the world of true crime, to this very day. We are here to uncover the layers of a mystery that is as bloody as it is literary, a case where the clues seem to have been plucked from the pages of a suspense novel, quite literally. This is the story of a mother who vanished into the autumn air, leaving behind a kitchen smeared with blood and a trail of library books that whispered of a darker intent. This is the disappearance of Joan Risch. To truly understand the gravity of this event, we must first immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of Lincoln, Massachusetts in 1961. This was not merely a suburb, it was an enclave of the elite, a historic town located just northwest of Boston. It was a place of winding country roads, stone walls, and colonial farmhouses that had been converted into estates for professionals, doctors, and executives. The foliage in late October would have been spectacular, in a canopy of burning reds and oranges that usually signaled the cozy approach of winter. In this idyllic setting lived the Risch family. Martin Risch was a successful executive at a paper company, a man whose career was on the rise. His wife, Joan, was 31 years old, a woman of striking intelligence and complexity. Joan was not your stereotypical 1950s housewife, though she certainly played the part on the surface. She was born Joan Bard in Brooklyn, New York, in 1930. Her early life was marked by a tragedy that would scar anyone's psyche. By the age of 10, she had lost both of her parents in a suspicious house fire, a calamity that later fueled endless speculation about her own psychological state. Raised by relatives, she excelled academically, earning a degree in English literature from Wilson College in Pennsylvania. No, she had worked in publishing, starting as a secretary and moving up the ranks, a testament to her ambition and sharp mind. After marrying Martin, she left the workforce to raise their two children, 4-year-old Lillian and 2-year-old David. By all accounts, she was a devoted mother, deeply involved in her community and eager to maintain the perfect home. Yet, those who knew her best described a woman who was intensely private, perhaps even hiding a tumult of emotions behind a polished exterior. The timeline of October 24th, 1961, begins with the mundane rhythm of domestic life. It was a morning like any other. The sun struggled to break through the clouds as Martin Risch prepared for a business trip. He awoke early, dressed in his suit, and drove to Logan Airport in Boston to catch an 8 a.m. flight to New York City. He planned to stay overnight in Manhattan. Joan served him breakfast, and they said their goodbyes. There was no indication of strife, no arguments overheard by neighbors, no sense of impending doom. Martin would later recall that Joan seemed perfectly normal, focused on the day ahead. After Martin left, Joan's day proceeded with the typical errands of a suburban mother. She woke the children, fed them breakfast, and prepared for an appointment. At 9 a.m., she drove her blue 1951 Chevrolet sedan to the town center. She had a dental appointment with a Dr. Lasker in Bedford. The dentist would later report that Joan seemed cheerful and relaxed. There was no sign of anxiety or distress. Following the appointment, she did a bit of shopping in a nearby department store, buying a few small items before heading back to Lincoln. But she picked up Lillian from a playdate and returned to the Risch home on Old Bedford Road around 11 a.m. Upon returning home, Joan gave the children lunch. The house, a charming two-story structure set back from the road, was quiet. At roughly 1 p.m., Joan put 2-year-old David down for his afternoon nap in his crib upstairs. Lillian, the 4-year-old, was sent across the street to play with the neighbor's son, Douglas Barker. The neighbor, Barbara Barker, was a close friend of Joan's. This was a routine occurrence, a simple exchange of child care that allowed mothers a few hours of respite. Barbara Barker noted nothing unusual when Joan dropped Lillian off. Joan was wearing a simple house dress and sneakers, the uniform of a mother ready to tackle housework. This is where the timeline begins to fracture, where the mundane dissolves into the mysterious. Between 1 p.m. and 2 p.m., the Risch household was silent. We know that the milkman delivered milk and the mailman delivered the post. Neither reported seeing anything amiss. The house stood still amongst the falling leaves. However, at approximately 2:15 p.m., Barbara Barker, looking out her window from across the street, noticed something that struck her as odd. She saw Joan, wearing a trench coat over her house dress, moving quickly up her own driveway. She appeared to be carrying something red, which Barbara assumed was a bundle of clothing or perhaps a child's red jacket. Barbara didn't think much of it at the moment. Perhaps Joan was chasing after a stray dog or rushing to grab something from the garage. But in hindsight, this sighting is the last confirmed visual of Joan Risch on her property. Time ticked by. The afternoon light began to fade. At 3:40 p.m., Barbara Barker brought Lillian back across the street. She expected to find Joan in the kitchen or the living room. Barbara opened the back door and called out. There was no answer. The house was eerily silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Assuming Joan was busy, or perhaps upstairs, Barbara left Lillian in the house and returned to her own home. But a nagging feeling persisted. It wasn't like Joan to leave Lillian unattended, and the silence was heavy, almost oppressive. At 4:15 p.m., Barbara looked out her window again. She saw Joan's car parked in the driveway. But something was wrong. The trunk of the car was open. This detail, small as it was, triggered an alarm in Barbara's mind. She decided to go back over. Taking Lillian by the hand, she walked back into the Risch kitchen. What she found this time would become the stuff of nightmares. The kitchen, usually a pristine workspace of yellow linoleum and tidy counters, was a chaotic scene of violence. The telephone had been ripped from the wall, the receiver dangling uselessly by its cord. A nearby table was overturned, and then there was the blood. It was not a puddle, but a series of smears and swirls coating the floor, the walls, and even the handset of the telephone. It looked as though someone had been grievously injured and had staggered around the room, clutching at surfaces for support. Barbara Barker grabbed Lillian and ran. She rushed back to her own house and immediately called the police. Within minutes, the tranquility of Old Bedford Road was shattered by the wail of sirens. Sergeant Mike McHugh of the Lincoln Police Department was the first to arrive. He entered the house with his gun drawn, expecting to find a murderer or a body. He found neither. He moved cautiously through the kitchen, noting the blood. He checked the rest of the house. Upstairs in his crib, 2-year-old David was sleeping soundly, completely unaware that his mother was missing and his kitchen was a slaughterhouse. The contrast was jarring. The innocence of the sleeping child against the brutality of the scene downstairs. McHugh searched the basement, the attic, the garage. Joan Risch was nowhere to be found. As detectives and forensic experts descended on the property, the investigation began in earnest. So they scrutinized the blood evidence with the technology available in 1961. The blood was type O. Joan Risch was type O. But so was her husband, and so was 45% of the population. DNA testing was decades away, so they could not definitively prove the blood belonged to Joan, though the circumstantial evidence strongly suggested it. What confused the investigators was the pattern of the blood. It wasn't consistent with a bludgeoning or a stabbing that had taken place in a single spot. There were smears that suggested someone trying to clean up, or perhaps someone crawling. Curiously, there were no bloody footprints leading out of the house. The trail of blood seemed to end in the kitchen. However, tiny drops of blood were later found leading to the driveway, stopping at the trunk of the car. And then came the discovery of the trash can. Inside the kitchen wastebasket, police found an empty liquor bottle and several empty beer bottles. This was perplexing. Joan was known to be a social drinker, perhaps having a cocktail with dinner, but she was not known to drink heavily during the day. The presence of the empty bottles suggested either a secret habit or the presence of someone else. Had she been drinking with an intruder? Or had she consumed the alcohol herself to build up the courage for something? As the police expanded their search, they notified Martin Risch in New York. He was pulled out of a meeting and told the devastating news. He immediately flew back to Boston. His shock seemed genuine. He had an airtight alibi. He was in Manhattan, surrounded by colleagues, at the time of the disappearance. He was quickly ruled out as a suspect, leaving investigators with a void where a perpetrator should be. The investigation took a darker turn when witnesses began to come forward with reports of a wandering woman. Later that afternoon, around the time Barbara Barker discovered the blood, motorists on Route 2A, a busy road nearby, reported seeing a woman walking along the shoulder. Their descriptions were harrowing. They described a woman who looked disoriented, her hair matted and messy. She was wearing a trench coat, but her legs were bare, and streaks of what looked like mud or dried blood were running down her calves. She appeared to be clutching her stomach. One witness, a delivery driver, said he slowed down to ask if she needed help, but she didn't acknowledge him. She just kept walking, her eyes fixed on the horizon, zombie-like. Another witness saw her leaning against a guardrail on Route 128, a major highway. The descriptions were consistent. A woman in distress, potentially injured, wandering aimlessly. But despite these sightings, no one stopped to pick her up. No one called the police immediately. It was a classic case of the bystander effect, compounded by the uncertainty of the situation. By the time police were alerted to these sightings and swept the area, the woman was gone. Was this Joan? The physical description matched. The trench coat matched the one Barbara Barker saw her wearing. The blood on the legs matched the scene in the kitchen. But if it was Joan, where was she going? And how could a woman, bleeding and disoriented, simply vanish from the side of a highway without leaving a trace? The case grew colder in the weeks that followed. But then came the revelation that would turn the Joan Risch disappearance into a legend of true crime. Investigators began looking into Joan's personal life, trying to build a psychological profile. They visited the Lincoln Public Library, where Joan was a frequent patron. What they found in her borrowing history sent a chill down their spines. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Joan Risch had checked out 25 books. Many of them were standard reading, but a specific subset of them dealt with a very particular theme: disappearances. She had read books about people who vanished without a trace. She had read books about women who staged their own deaths to escape their lives. One book in particular, titled Into Thin Air, told the story of a woman who meticulously faked her disappearance, leaving behind bloodstains and evidence of a struggle to cover her tracks. Another book, The Wife Who Did Not Exist, had a similar plot. This discovery split the investigation and the public opinion right down the middle. On one side, you had the theory of the staged disappearance. Proponents of this theory argued that Joan, dissatisfied with her suburban life, or perhaps suffering from a mental break related to her traumatic childhood, had used these books as a manual. They pointed to the lack of footprints, suggesting she had been careful. They pointed to the empty liquor bottles as a way to dull the pain of self-inflicted wounds to create the blood scene. They argued that the sightings of the wandering woman were Joan acting out her escape, perhaps meeting an accomplice down the road. The fact that she left her children was the biggest counter-argument. But those who supported this theory suggested that in her mental state, she might have believed they were better off without her, or that Martin would care for them. On the other side was the theory of the botched home procedure. It was 1961. Abortion was illegal and dangerous. Some investigators speculated that Joan might have been pregnant and attempted to induce a miscarriage at home, or had a back-alley doctor come to the house. The blood in the kitchen, particularly the pelvic region smears described by witnesses on the road, could be consistent with a hemorrhage. The empty alcohol bottles could have been used for pain relief. If a procedure had gone wrong and she began to bleed out, she might have panicked, run out of the house seeking help, and become delirious from blood loss. This would explain the phone being ripped out, perhaps in a moment of pain or a struggle with a practitioner who didn't want her to call for help. And then, of course, there was the stranger theory. A few neighbors reported seeing a battered blue sedan parked near the Risch driveway earlier that day. It was a car that didn't belong to anyone in the neighborhood. Was this the vehicle of an intruder? Did someone enter the house, attack Joan, and abduct her? The blood type matched Joan, but fingerprints found in the kitchen were never identified. Were they from a killer? If she was abducted, why leave the child upstairs unharmed? Why stage a scene that looked so chaotic? Let us delve deeper into the forensic puzzle of the kitchen, for it holds the most contradictions. If the amount of blood found was significant, about half a pint on the floor and walls, but experts at the time stated it was not necessarily a fatal amount. A healthy adult could lose that much blood and still function, still walk. However, the distribution was the key. There were high marks on the wall, suggesting blood had been cast off from a weapon or a flailing limb. There were smears on the floor that looked like someone had tried to wipe them up with paper towels, some of which were found in the trash. Why would an attacker stop to clean up? Or why would a victim, in the midst of escaping, try to clean the floor? This detail heavily favored the staging theory. It implied a presence of mind, a methodical action amidst the chaos. Furthermore, we must consider the psychological landscape of Joan Risch. She was a woman who had rebuilt her life from the ashes of her parents' death. She was intelligent, well-read, and seemingly composed. But beneath that, was there a simmering desire to flee? The books she read were not just casual mysteries. They were manuals on how to erase oneself. In one of the books, the protagonist uses ketchup to simulate blood. Joan didn't use ketchup. The blood was real. But the inspiration was undeniable. Did she read these stories and see a doorway out of her existence? The search for Joan Risch was one of the most extensive in Massachusetts history. The woods surrounding Lincoln were combed by hundreds of volunteers, police officers, and Boy Scouts. Ponds were dragged. The National Guard was called in. Helicopters scanned the dense autumn forests. But not a single scrap of clothing, no shoe, no purse, and no body was ever found. She had simply ceased to exist. Martin Risch never stopped looking for his wife. He refused to leave the house in Lincoln. He kept the same phone number for decades, hoping that one day Joan would call. He raised Lillian and David as a single father, living in the home where their mother had vanished. He never remarried. He died in 2009, taking his heartbreak to the grave, never knowing what happened to the woman he loved. The children, Lillian and David, grew up in the shadow of this mystery. They have largely stayed out of the public eye, victims of a tragedy that has no closure. The house on Old Bedford Road still stands, a silent witness to the events of that Tuesday afternoon. So, where does that leave us today? The case of Joan Risch remains open, though it is colder than the New England winter. Modern forensic analysts who have reviewed the case files often lean towards the medical emergency theory. The behavior of the woman on the road, clutching her stomach, disoriented, bleeding, is classic shock. The lack of a body suggests that perhaps she wandered deep into the woods, into an area that was missed by searchers, and succumbed to the elements, her remains scattered by time and nature. Or perhaps she fell into a construction pit, of which there were many in the developing suburbs of the time. Yet, the library books remain the thorn in the side of the accidental theory. The coincidence is too precise, too glaring to ignore. Is it possible that Joan Risch pulled off the perfect disappearance? Did she survive her injuries, meet someone on the highway, and start a new life under a new name, leaving her children and her past behind? If so, she took that secret to her death. For no credible lead has ever surfaced to place her alive after 1961. There is also the chilling possibility of a predator. The unknown blue car. The era was not without its dangers, even in Lincoln. Could a serial offender have seized the opportunity, entering the unlocked house, subduing Joan, and taking her away? The blood in the kitchen would be the result of her fighting for her life. The cleaning attempt could have been the attacker trying to minimize evidence before realizing the futility and fleeing. As we look back at the disappearance of Joan Risch, we are left with a tapestry of contradictions. We have a devoted mother and a dissatisfied woman. We have a bloody crime scene and a list of books about faking death. We have eyewitnesses who saw a ghost walking the highway, and a husband who waited a lifetime for a phone call that never came. It is a story that forces us to question how well we truly know the people around us. It challenges our perception of the safe suburban sanctuary. It reminds us that even in the most manicured of lives, chaos is only one decision or one accident away. The files on Joan Risch sit in the archives, yellowing with age. The blood samples are long gone. The witnesses have passed away. All that remains is the story, the speculation, and the enduring mystery of the woman who walked out of her kitchen and into the void. What do you believe happened on that October afternoon? Did Joan Risch orchestrate her own exit, inspired by the fiction she consumed? Was she the victim of a tragic medical crisis that spiraled out of control? Or did a predator shatter the peace of Lincoln? On taking her into the darkness? This has been a deep dive into the archives of DCF investigations. The silence of the Risch kitchen still echoes after more than 60 years. If you have a theory, if you see a pattern we have missed, share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, because sometimes the key to solving the unsolvable lies in a fresh perspective. Until next time, stay observant and stay safe.